show, Logan.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited. We talked a little bit ahead of time, um, and we've run in the same circles for quite a while. I know you've been in the agency space for a while, but I know recently you went from kind of serving agencies and being in agencies to starting your own thing. Um, and right now, from what we discussed, you're focusing really mainly on B2B webinars as a way to generate leads. And I really wanted to kind of dig into that and understand more about that. So, can you talk about kind of what made you decide to focus on that so hard and how has that worked out for you?
hmm Yeah, for me, it was two reasons. One, I am a big fan of niching down, being known for a very specific problem that you solve. Obviously, very much influenced by one of our mutual friends, Chris Dubois, who runs an agency community that we're both a part of. And secondly, if I were, I think this is true for an agency or any sort of business, whether you're solo or larger, going to market when you have some social proof behind what you are offering, I think is so important. And I had a little bit of that. So for me, the journey was a little bit meandering. Like after about 10 years of B2B tech sales, I was in the agency space for the first time in 2018. I got to be a part of a podcast production agency that grew really quickly over 4 years. And then after that, I had my first in-house marketing role. And I was at teamwork.com. I ran their podcast and their webinar series. And the webinar series was a success in a lot of ways. It was a great brand builder. It was a great audience builder. But after 2 years of running that program, the direct pipeline attribution that I saw was not all that impressive. And so when I was in my next role, when I went back agency side, so I flip-flopped back and forth to 3 roles in a row, and I was running sales and marketing at an agency called Business Builders. I looked at, well, what could I do differently if I approached webinars a little bit differently for our own lead gen for the agency? I made some tweaks. We can talk about some of those specifically, but long story short, I 5x'd my conversion rate from webinar sign up to booked sales call. And so as I was thinking about launching Demand Shift, one, folks like Chris Dubois and Nick Bennett, who had been in my mind a lot around niching down, focusing on a specific problem and being known for the corresponding solution was already in my head. So I was kind of searching for how can I take my experience and niche down around a specific problem, and also one that I have some social proof that I can speak to. Because when I launched Demand Shift in June of 2025, I didn't have any clients. I didn't have any client results to speak to. I had no testimonials or case studies. So I had to look at my own experience and say, where could I go to market with some of my own social proof and be my own case study to start with? And so that's what I did. Is when I launched Demand Shift, I talked about this journey from webinars for 2 years as an in-house marketer that were okay, but not directly leading to the results that I wanted, to the framework that I built and started using in-house at this other agency that led to this 5x increase. And so to me, going to market with a very specific problem and some starting social proof was really what led me to start Demand Shift and be known for this webinar fast track framework that is kind of our core service now. I think there was a second part to that question as well. Remind me what that one was, David.
Well, just how's that working out for you so
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
or so far? I mean,
Yeah, natural next step, right? And so 6 months in, I would say the advice that I had always gotten and even preached to other agency owners around niching down really did work well. I did a launch post on day one after founding the agency, and I had one client, actually 2 clients who were in my network, kind of already in my orbit, who knew me, trusted me, but then saw what I was offering and said, oh, actually, I do need that. And then my third client of my first 3 that came from this first week on LinkedIn, we had never met before. We maybe had a mutual connection, but because I went to market and said, hey, here's kind of my story. Here's the problem I encountered. Here's how I, fixed it for myself and how I'm transitioning that into something I can do for others, that resonated with him as well. And so this story of niching down, going to market with a very specific problem and offer, it helped me land my first 3 clients in the first week or 2. So that was awesome.
Yeah.
And that's continued on. But 2 other things happened that were a little bit surprising to me. Secondly, people who I known for a long time on LinkedIn or previous colleagues or previous clients, they started tagging me in things of like, oh, hey, this new webinar platform just launched, or hey, this report dropped on webinars. You might want to comment on that and incorporate that into some of your content. So I started getting kind of these getting tagged in things and known for something actually really pretty quickly. Right. And
Mm.
so the referrals that way came as well as actually like, hey, I talked to someone who's like struggling with their webinar program. They might be a good client for you. So the second thing that kind of surprised me was the referrals, and not just new clients, other sorts of referrals of being tagged in things, include into things that could be helpful or timely for me. And then the
Yeah.
last thing that's happened in the last couple months is I've actually started to enter conversations with different providers in the webinar space on affiliate or creator or even managed service provider sort of partnerships
Mm.
because there aren't a whole lot of people who are doing webinars as a service, right? There's tons of people doing LinkedIn ghostwriting, obviously web design, all of these other areas, even podcasting now. As far as service providers, there are a lot out there, but because I kind of chose to choose to swim out into maybe a little bit more of a blue ocean, if you're familiar with that book,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, it became easier for these like referral and other strategic partnerships to come to the surface without me even necessarily needing to hunt them down.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, I think you mentioned referrals, not just like the classic, our happy client give us referrals, but just by being known as kind of being the webinar lead guy, it was like people thought, oh, well, you're the person who immediately comes to mind
Mhm.
if there's something related to webinars that comes up. So it's definitely a strong um, case for the niching down of things. I did want to talk a little bit just about webinars in general. I know, I think some people are bullish on them, some people are not so much. And I think a lot of that comes down to, you know, maybe some people have expectations of what a webinar is, that sort of thing. I know a lot of people will register, but then not show up, that sort of thing. So can you talk a little bit about how, I guess, what your thoughts are on just kind of on the webinar as a medium and kind of how that plays into your strategy?
Mhm. Yeah, you touched on a couple things there that are definitely applicable for myself in an attendee or registrant of webinars. Whenever we're doing marketing, right, we should look at what's the behavior. If we fit our own buyer persona, what's my behavior like in these sorts of situations? And I'm one of those people who registers for a webinar, and I don't even look at when it's going to be, what the date is. I'm just like, hey, if I want this content, I'm going to sign up now. Hopefully it goes onto my calendar, and if it's at a good time, I'll show up live, or I'll plan to catch the replay. So I'm part of that 65% that typically is a quote unquote no show for a B2B webinar. And we actually just surveyed over 250 B2B marketing leaders and agency folks, and we found that 65% no show rate or 35% attendance rate, whether you want to look at the glasses half full or half empty, is actually true. That 35% rate is what held true in our B2B webinars for lead gen report. Actually, if anybody, we're getting ready to launch that full report. The wait list is open. So if you go to demandshift.co/report, you can get access to this data as well as some of the other insights. So that's demandshift.co/report. And that was actually one of the things that I think people struggle with webinars, as like we saw in some of the survey data. Yeah, we get these registrants, but we can never get our attendance rate high enough to justify it, because then we're converting a small amount of those people who show up into a next step, which is one of the things I wanted to start to solve for when I developed our webinar fast track framework. Is that's a real problem with webinars, is if we plan the webinar, we promote the webinar, we try and get as many people there as we can. And let's say we get 100 people registered, only 35 show up. That means only 1 out of 3 are hearing our pitch or getting that CTA for the next step, whether that's booking a demo, starting a trial, or taking some sort of sales call. Those are usually the typically three options. So I started looking for ways of how can you increase that conversion rate and get that right hook, that CTA, in front of a higher percentage of that audience. So we can talk about kind of how we did that and some of those things as we go a little bit further. But that was one of the things we've been looking at a ton. The other piece that was interesting in the data from our report was that when we asked B2B marketers how effective are webinars as a lead gen tactic, it ranked just over 7 out of 10. So the majority of folks are still seeing webinars, even though it's kind of like, hey, didn't they kind of peak during the pandemic when everybody was at home and everybody started doing webinars again? A lot of marketers are still seeing them as effective, but it's usually about tweaking several things in the process in order to get an overall lift for them to be worth it. The last thing I'll say on kind of the like state of webinars, where do they fit, what's working, what's not, is, obviously we've had gated content as marketers for a while now, right? And people are more guarded. Oftentimes people have, fake email addresses that they put in if you're going to make them register to get content. Webinars are a little bit different because it's almost like there actually is a reason to give you my email address, because I need the calendar invite if I'm going to show up live. And so webinars kind of sit a little bit different than traditional lead gen gated content, because it doesn't feel like it's such a forced thing to give your email address in order to get this content. So that's just like kind of an interesting little wrinkle in how I see webinars interacting with audiences today.
Well, and I would imagine that, especially in an era of lots of AI-driven written content, putting your face in front of people can be kind of a, maybe, I don't know if value add is the right term, but it engenders a little bit more trust, which I think for agencies in particular,
yes,
trust is a very important piece of being able to warm up a potential lead, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. As I told the story earlier about getting my first 3 clients, one of those, when I hopped on the call with him after he saw my LinkedIn post, we hopped on a Zoom call, and I had seen that he had been in a registrant and attendee of that webinar series I ran for teamwork.com for several years. And we had connected on LinkedIn and exchanged some DMs, but we had never actually been one-on-one on a call. But you know how sometimes those LinkedIn connections, you're like, have we been on a call, David? I can't remember, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's been a while. And I asked him that question. I was like, well, have we ever actually been on a call? And I'll never forget, he told me, well, no, but I feel like I've been on this call 100 times, because he had been a live attendee, active in the chat, on all of these webinars that I had hosted. So to your point, the trust factor that was there with him as a potential client was just extremely accelerated by that live interaction. Even though it wasn't necessarily one-to-one, it was live on video, answering live questions. And it wasn't asynchronous video, and it also wasn't AI generated text content. And I think that that's an example of exactly what you're talking about there with building that trust factor, especially in an agency where you have a service-based business where the people are the product, right? Whether you're a solo agency or a larger team, I think that holds true. And fast forward 6 months, that prospect conversation has turned into one of the highest performing client engagements that I have, the results that we've been able to drive. And I don't know if that would have happened if I didn't have that trust built up with him before he was a client.
Yeah. I do have a quick question. We didn't discuss this previously, but it's more about, I've been to a variety of different types of webinars, and I feel like there's the webinars that feel like maybe they're like pre-recorded, and it's really obvious that they're pre-recorded. And they're, like you're expecting the sales pitch, like the hard sales pitch at the end. There's other ones that are just kind of more, here are some trends in the industry, that sort of thing. Does the substance of, or like the content of the webinar, make a difference in your framework? Or is there anything that you found like this works better, this works worse, when it comes to the actual meat of a webinar?
Mm-hmm. So I'll say three things. One, I think that the way that we approach webinars with our clients at Demand Shift is this balance of thought leadership and lead generation. I think that executed correctly, a webinar series can help execute both. And I've seen some data from other providers in the space. I think it was Goldcast, that the attendance rate and the conversion rates are typically higher for webinars when they are part of an ongoing series rather than kind of this one-off flash in the pan thing. Secondly, I think that there is a spot, and we've seen good success with both live and on-demand webinars. Oftentimes people talk about repurposing content from an hour-long webinar that you do, because when was the last time you had one of your executives or your subject matter experts speaking for an hour on video recorded, that you could turn into reels, shorts, LinkedIn content, carousels, blog posts, all of this. And what we do with our clients oftentimes is we don't just say, okay, this month's webinar is this. How many people did we get registered? How many people did we get to attend? And then we're on to the next one. We are on to the next one, but we're also looking at all this content that comes from it. How do we repurpose that and point back to the on-demand replay? Because some people, they only want to watch on demand. I'm one of those who enjoys being able to play it at 2x. And if it's an hour-long webinar, even if it's good, I could consume that in 30 minutes instead. That's great,
Yeah.
right?
No, that's a great point.
And then the third thing, you mentioned it actually, the hard sales pitch people are always waiting for at the end. And I've done it before where I'm like, okay, we've got our slide. We're going to kind of make the pitch for next steps. And I'm just seeing the participant number drop and drop and drop, right? Because one, they saw it coming, and two, like they've pretty much got what they wanted to out of the webinar at this point, or maybe they're just tired and they need a few minutes before their next meeting. I had one client who went from booking no calls off of their webinar to the next one. They booked nearly 24 by making this one switch. They moved the CTA up in front of the Q&A section. So instead of intro, content, Q&A, and then CTA at the end, they moved the CTA up in front of the Q&A, almost like a little ad break. So it didn't get buried. You're not, if it's at the end, you're only getting it in front of 35% and even lower because people are dropping off at the end. And it also feels very natural to say, hey, we're not just kind of like forcing this in. We don't feel awkward. We feel confident that if you got value from this and you want more help, this is the next step that you can take. And here's how we can help you. Like I said, and that's how you blend, back to my first point, thought leadership and lead gen. You don't kind of bury it, you make it apparent, but you make it timely and easy for people to take that next step, and you get it in front of more people rather than kind of that dwindling participant list at the very end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're trying to convert them before they're looking to bail on their own. Well, I know I'd like to get back into your framework.
Okay.
I know like kind of a big part of your framework is kind of this upfront qualifying sort of thing. Is that during kind of maybe you can just kind of jump into it, kind of give the high level overview of what exactly it looks like.
Yeah. It's funny you say high level. High level is one of the tools that I use consistently that helps me execute this. I've actually built a snapshot around it if anybody's interested, but for any other high level agencies out there, basically we're trying to fix what I call the conversion cliff, right? We already have a drop off from registrant to attendee live, that 65% no-show rate, as you mentioned. And then we have another conversion cliff where it's typically less than 1% of webinar registrants that are actually converting into booked sales calls, for a number of the reasons we've already talked about. So the tweak that I tested and then ended up seeing great results with, which allowed me to kind of package this up in my framework and our service at Demand Shift, is getting away from the dead end thank you page. So most people, they register for a webinar, They put in first name, maybe last name, and email, and they get a thank you message that says something like, check your inbox. The meeting invite has been sent to your email. Well, guess what? 100% of your webinar registrants are seeing that thank you page, right? And that thank you page isn't really moving them along. It's not providing really any value to them either. And so what we do at Demand Shift is a key part of our framework is called this two-step sign-up process. So the first step stays as is. It is a simple registration form to get signed up and registered for the webinar. The second step is, instead of being redirected to a thank you page, registrants are redirected to a page with a survey on it. And on that survey, we ask some qualifying questions, we ask some discovery questions, and we end with basically a book a sales call sort of question: book a demo, start a trial, schedule a sales call. And what's great about this is, one, we can only show that offer to book a sales call to the folks who are qualified, because in the 5 or 6 questions that we ask in this survey, we can put some logic behind it and say, hey, if it's just a one-person company or we don't serve anyone under $1 million, we can route them to something else rather than the book a sales call question. But if they are qualified and they say yes, then we just show them the calendar for the salesperson or the sales team right then and there. And it's this tweak, it's this two-step sign up flow that took my conversion rate from about 1 to 2% to about 10% from webinar sign up to booked sales call. And I thought maybe, hey, this is kind of rubbed people the wrong way, maybe, because now I'm moving the CTA up much further in the process, right? We were talking earlier about moving it from the end of the webinar to maybe like 2/3 of the way through. Now we're talking about moving it all the way up to the sign up process. Is this going to rub people the wrong way? And now that we've tested it over at least a dozen clients at Demand Shift, I can tell you that's not the case. Everyone's conversion rate from sign up to sales call has increased. We've even seen some as high as 18 or 19%. And as I thought about it, it made sense. People are raising their hand. That registration is some sort of signal that they see some value in the content that you're sharing. They have a problem that you're talking about that they associate with. And oftentimes, maybe they're just not seeing that CTA, or it's being buried at the end of the webinar, or they're not even showing up and they're not seeing it. And let's face it, everybody's ignoring our follow-up emails after the webinar because they're not really segmented. They're not really personalized. The personalization is maybe just based on the bucket of attended versus did not attend. And we changed the line at the beginning of like, thanks for attending, or sorry, we missed you. Right. Yeah. Which, by the way, the survey questions can also help with that piece of it, even the folks that do say no to booking a call on the front end.
Yeah. When you pull together those questions, I imagine, people have just registered. I'm not sure like what sort of incentive there is for them to be like, oh, I'm going to do a survey. So is there something special that you do to kind of make them think, oh, okay, you know what? I just, registered, but I'm also going to fill this out now.
Yeah. So there's 2 ways you can do it. One, you can make the framing of the questions feel like a continuous part of the registration process, which it is, because if we gather some more information about the audience members, then we know who we're speaking to. We even if we just ask some basic questions around company size, title, seniority level, industry, it really is completing the registration process. And so oftentimes we'll use a line that just says, complete your free webinar registration by answering a few more questions below. And then we use either surveys in high level or a tool like Typeform that can display one question at a time. And we usually don't go more than 5, 6, maybe 7. My kids are going to be saying 6, 7 in the other room, by the way, now that I did that. Not too many questions, so it's easy for them as well. So that's kind of the first route and like the language, the way you could tee it up. The second is you could kind of play off a little bit of exclusivity, and it's true, because you're not going to offer to book a call with just everyone, only those who qualify. So you could kind of frame your discovery call or your sales process as something valuable. Like I have one client who focuses a lot on AI, SEO, and GEO, and where everything's going with search. And so what we did was framed it, answer a few questions to see if you qualify for a free AI SEO audit. And then we ask those same discovery questions. We ask them if they want to book a call. If they say yes, we show them the calendar. If they book, then we give those people a little bit more value. We don't just treat it as kind of a standard discovery call, but let's face it, if you're an agency, you should be building in some value into those discovery calls anyway. So this might just be, not something that you reserve exclusively, but you just do as part of your sales process, right? You give away some sort of analysis or audit or recommendations to folks who are booking a sales call with you. So those are the two routes, the ways that you can do it as an incentive that we've seen work really, really well.
That's great. I guess one of the things that, so we talked a little bit about, this captures more of your overall registrants. You have this series of questions that you're asking them. Like, I guess, what else, are there any other pieces to the framework?
Yeah. So we talk about on the front end promo tactics that work. The second is the two-step sign-up process that we talked about. The third is a high-value live show. The fourth is personalized, segmented follow-up. And then the fifth is repurposing and amplifying. So I would say, of the 5 parts of the framework, we've talked about most of them to some degree. I think one that we didn't touch on too much is promo tactics that work. And this is something else that we surveyed folks on that B2B webinar report that we're releasing soon that I mentioned. And what's interesting is that email is consistently one of the highest drivers of webinar signups from the marketers that we talk to. However, most people are using email in one way. They're emailing their list to try and get people to the webinar, which, if you think about it, it's not a great way to add more people to your funnel, right? You might be re-engaging dormant leads and those sorts of things. So I started to think about, well, if email is effective for getting people from one channel on email over to another registered for a webinar, what other ways can we use email? And 2 ways have been really effective for us at Demand Shift and some of our clients. One, surprisingly enough, is cold email. And just going outbound to your target ICP, and instead of pitching them directly with your product, slow roll it a little bit and say, hey, if you're struggling with this, we're doing a free hour-long webinar in 2 weeks that might be applicable. And the CTA is just to register for the event. So that's been a great way to use tools like Apollo or Zoom Info to get email addresses of your target ICP, but not just spam them with a hard sales pitch that is probably going to burn bridges with 95% of your audience who's not in market right now, right?
Right.
The second is partnering with industry newsletters or strategic partners who do have an email list of an audience that you want to reach, and either paying for ad placement, paying for email sends, or doing some sort of collaboration or swap where you can get access to that email audience and have the webinar be that CTA. Those have been 2 really, really effective ways that I think a lot of B2B teams are not leveraging email in order to get more registrants and more new registrants access to new audiences for their webinar or webinar series.
Gotcha. I have a question I was just thinking through what questions our audience might have around this. And, I'm sure some of them have an existing webinar platform. Some of them have never done a webinar. Does it make a difference what platform they're using, or does this approach work is it kind of agnostic with, whatever the platform is that you're using?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say with this caveat, the landscape is definitely changing, right? I am looking at a few other new up and coming webinar platforms or platforms that have been built for podcasting or video that are now expanding into webinars. Like Riverside is a tool that I've used for years and years for podcasting and just video interview sort of content, even customer testimonials. They now have an option that I'm testing out for webinars where you can register, you can give audience access, and that sort of stuff. And so things are changing. I would say the things you want to look out for is, can you, either through native integrations or through Zapier or Make or some other sort of automation tool, two important things I would think about if you're thinking about a webinar platform. One, can you build your own form and registration process and not be locked into only having to use the webinar platform's sign up page? Because if you can't do that, you can't execute our two-step sign up process, which has led to phenomenal results, as we talked about. The second is, and this is really kind of in the weeds, but it's a big one for me because I've seen it change that attendance rate by as much as 25%, is when people register, do you have the option automatically to send them a calendar invite? Zoom and a few other platforms send what they call a ICS file, which basically is like, if you've ever registered for a webinar and it's like, oh, this looks like a meeting invite that David would send to me if we were just having a meeting. That, if you don't have that piece and it just sends a confirmation email, even if it has the links of like add to calendar, Google, Outlook, Apple Calendar, people are just, that's another friction point, and people are very often not clicking those add to calendar buttons. So those are two things I look out for. There's other differences in streaming capabilities if you want to live stream the webinar to other social platforms, or the quality and workflow of repurposing. So those would take a little bit longer to answer, but that's kind of my starting point of the things that I know are really important in affecting the attendance and the conversion rate when you're picking a platform.
Awesome. Well, this is super helpful. I wanted to kind of wrap things up by just asking, I mean, you've shared a lot about the inner workings of this. You're not shy about kind of, pulling back the curtain on this. You're essentially giving away the recipe. Are you worried that people, might take it and run with it, that you don't benefit from it? Like, why exactly are you open to sharing it so widely?
It comes back to that one word that we used much earlier in the conversation, and that's trust. I think I've heard this from Alex Hermosi and others, is that if you can show and prove to someone that you can solve a small problem for them, they're going to trust you to solve a potentially larger problem. And then if you solve that, they're going to trust you to solve a potentially larger problem, right? And this is true for agencies, but it's general in business. The tougher and more expensive a problem is to solve, the more that you can charge and the more that you can make as a business. And so from a selfish capitalistic perspective, like that is the goal. But I also think that from a more, just benevolent standpoint, that you are helping out people who wouldn't be a good fit for your services. And you're not really losing out on that, because the people who are going to go the DIY route, or they are going to not be able to afford your services and they're going to have to go the DIY route, you're not really missing out on them as potential clients anyway. Because I mean, they're not going to buy from you. And actually, you may save time not getting them into your funnel and trying to sell them, and wasting both your time on a sales process that actually isn't going to go anywhere. And then the last thing I would say is, I've actually had folks follow me on LinkedIn or hear me on a podcast like this, implement part of my process. I just got one the other day where this marketing leader, they're like, we have the capability to do all this. We don't need your service. Can I ask you a few questions so we can implement this? And then he came back to me and he said, we 20x'd our results in our webinar conversion to booked sales call. And I said, man, that's awesome. Can I get a quote from you, even though you're not a client, that says, hey, we implemented part of Logan's framework at Demand Shift, and these are the results that we got. And now that's on a testimonial section on my website. I never would have gotten that if I weren't kind of liberal with giving away the, more of the recipe, as you mentioned.
That's awesome. Well, I think too, like if people implement it on their own, but they know that like you were the kind of the person who shared that with them, then if they do run into somebody who does maybe need that type of service for them, they'd be like, yeah, I can show you how it's done, or you should just talk to Logan and his team can do it for you. So you get like some more of those referrals from non-customers, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, there's lots of ripples that come out from that, right? There's someone who does it themselves now, but then they move to another company where they're just being asked more to manage budget and get it done. And they're like, oh, well, I use Logan's framework over here. I could use it here, but this time I want him to do it, or refer someone else. Or, right now I'm working on a downsell offer where I'm packaging up this framework into a step-by-step course with some more like kind of light coaching instead of the full done for you package. So, that's another thing, not to kind of push people towards that, but for other agency owners listening to this, thinking about the problem that you solve, there are probably a few different ways you could solve it for people. You could show them how to do it. You could do it with them, or you could do it for them. So if doing it for them is the only option that you have, you may have a way to package up the, show them how to do it or do it with them options for that problem that you solve. And you might actually be able to capture more revenue that way. And it might even be more profitable because it's not as hands-on. Maybe it's kind of build it once and less ongoing maintenance for that sort of service, or, a digital product like a course, of course.
Awesome. Well, before I wrap up, I had like one other question. We didn't discuss this earlier, but are there other maybe frequently asked questions that you get kind of around this, or around, what people should have for their webinars, any sort of component of this that maybe we didn't address today, that it's kind of like you're just anticipating what other questions people might have?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds very basic, but one of the questions I get is, how do I start planning the content for my webinar series? And like we said earlier, when you're able to build a series, you see higher registration rates, higher attendance rates, and you can build that trust over time, just like I did with that client that I mentioned earlier. And so I'm a big fan of doing some deep research on the problem that you solve and the questions that your audience is asking around that problem. So one of the things we do with new clients at Demand Shift is we use this audience research prompt that we've developed to take their persona and their industry, go out and have ChatGPT look at LinkedIn, look at X, look at Reddit, look at Quora, for folks who identify as this persona and are asking questions in this broad area, and surface the 12 most frequently asked questions that they are asking about that topic area. And that becomes a great spot to easily plan your first 3 webinars. If you're doing monthly, now you've got your first quarter's plan ready to go. Speaking of giving away things, we actually do give away this prompt if you want to use it. If you go to demandshift.co/prompt, so demandshift.co/prompt, you can get this prompt for free. If you do that, I just recommend using it with ChatGPT and turn on deep research. Don't just use it in kind of the plain Jane. ChatGPT 5.1 is at the time of this recording. Other people listening to this, it'll probably be a new version, but make sure you turn on deep research. If you go get that prompt and then you use it, you plug in your persona in your industry or topic area, make sure you turn on deep research before you use it.
That's amazing. Well, thanks again for sharing all this detail and all this insight behind this approach. For folks who want to learn more about the process, the framework, more about Demand Shift, what's the best way for them to kind of keep up with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can grab some of those resources we mentioned earlier, or if you just want to learn more about the framework, how we actually help, if you think we can help you or one of your clients, demandshift.co, or you can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. Logan Lyles, last name is Lyles. I'm pretty easy to look up on LinkedIn and pretty open about accepting connection requests. Let me know you heard me on the show, and that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Logan, for coming on the show. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.